This is Ivy Unleashed,
a Gold Ivy production.
Welcome back to Ivy Unleashed. We are so excited you are here because today we are talking about something that Andrew and I both struggle with majorly, and we know the women around us do too. We're talking about our inner critic and imposter syndrome. And we have brought you therapist Angela Kerrigan to discuss just how we tame our inner beast. So Angela, welcome to Ivy Unleashed.
Hi, thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Yes, we're happy you're here and really thankful for the work that you do because, you know, as a therapist, you sit in a room with people to talk about these things, but we want to bring it to light with like the personal struggle, put a big spotlight on it that we all have this. We all talk to ourselves a certain way. I have 3 kids and I can see how they even talk to themselves in their little minds at this age. And so I can't wait to talk about all of this. But first, I want to hear more about you and what brought you personally and professionally to where you're at now in your career.
Yeah. So I'm a therapist practicing in Texas and New York. So I practice all virtually right now. Ever since COVID, that's kind of become the norm. I work mostly with, millennials, a lot of women, a lot of folks of color, especially because I'm Asian. For folks who are not watching, but rather listening, I'm an Asian American woman who, growing up, I felt like I didn't see too many faces in the mental health field that looked like me. And, struggling with anxiety as a teenager, I just didn't have too many places to look to understand what is going on besides just like clinically, oh, it's anxiety, here's some meds, right? There's just so much of that cultural and environment component that we forget about. And so that was I didn't know it back then, but I think that was one of my first motivators to enter the mental health space. So here I am today. That's how I arrived. Long story short, I went to social work school first, and then I got my license to practice therapy.
Yeah. And one thing that we love that you do is you have basically a weekly check-in with the people that follow you to just get questions that they have thrown at you. And I feel like it's a really nice way if you've never done therapy or if you're curious, what can I ask a therapist?
Or the wait list is so long right now.
Yes.
And you need access, you need help, or financially you can't afford it. It is expensive. So making it more accessible is what I love.
Yeah. And I love hearing what other people ask because it might be a question you didn't even realize you needed to ask. And so thank you for providing that. I mean, that is your time. It's unpaid to go live on Instagram and provide that service. But I just wish all therapists did it. I think it's just like a beautiful service you provide to the world. So thank you.
Yeah. So I will say I have a pretty modest following on Instagram, but, community is really everything. I know that sounds really like cliche to say that, but I think when you have a public business account, really, I base everything on feedback from people, right? Like I want to know what people are interested in and what people want to know about. And you're right, as you said, people don't understand what therapy is because it's done in a room, it's private. And so to kind of like shed some light onto what that might look like, here are some questions that maybe you thought you were struggling with on your own, but a ton of other people also want to know, right? So I think it removes a lot of the shame and maybe even feelings of isolation around certain topics too. So I find it to be fun, the IG lives, the Q&As. So I do it once a week. When I can on my lunch break. So yeah, that's one of the things that I do.
Yeah. And I'm curious what questions you do get. We obviously have our questions for you on this episode around inner critic and imposter syndrome, but what do you feel like most people within those topics ask you?
I can't think of, to be honest, common questions, but I will say that there's a common theme where a lot of folks that think that their experience with the inner critic or imposter syndrome is unique to them. So what I mean by that is everyone is just walking around thinking that they're alone with it
Mhm.
and that they have to suffer alone. And it makes sense, because why would we just openly talk about it and be like, hey, I've got a really strong self-critical thought happening right now, right? We're just kind of dealing with it on our own. So that's one of the themes that I've noticed.
Yeah. Well, and people think that's the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Like they think, oh, I'm bad at this. I'm not made for this. I'm not worthy of this. And it's not true. You're having these thoughts that just, you're berating yourself all day about these mistakes that you made or what you're not good at. And talking with someone or hearing somebody else that's going through it, I feel like you're creating this connection that we're all craving, right? We all want to know that we're not alone. And you mentioned community, and I think that's so important, especially too, as you talked about, like people of different cultures that I think are drawn to you too, to address their feelings and to have someone to be like, is this normal that I feel this way? I feel really alone, just like you said when you were younger. And so I love it. And I just want to kind of start with the inner critic, right? It's something you talk a lot about. And just to kind of identify, what is that? Like, what is your inner critic? Where does it come from? How do we start addressing this elephant in the room that we can't see?
Yeah. So the inner critic is, you could define it in many different ways. And it is, we'll probably get into imposter syndrome later on, and I'll talk about how they're related. So the inner critic is like this inner, you can think of it as your inner voice, where it's either disapproving of what you're doing, or it's constantly disappointed or frustrated. And it's like pretty much berating you, right? There is a healthy baseline of an inner critic, right? That self-critic, where we all have that, and you need to have that because it keeps us in check. It's a good protective mechanism to have. So just a side note here, narcissists don't have that. So most of us do, and it's normal. The type of inner critic that is a little bit more harsh and isn't inherently something you were born with is the one that we've inherited from someone else early on, say in our childhood or our adolescence, and we internalize some of that messaging to become our own. So an example of that might be a parent, a well-meaning parent, or a parent figure who's just very anxious about certain things, and they might criticize you, or a teacher who has very high expectations of you. It could be a high school bully. It could also be a broader societal messaging around beauty standards or what standards of success might look like. And then you internalize all of this messaging as you're growing up, and that becomes your inner critic, right? And I will say too that the inner critic is almost always driven by some source of fear, whether it's a fear of failure, that's where perfectionism comes in, or the fear of disappointing other people. So that could look like people pleasing, not being able to set boundaries, things like that. So it's always fear driven.
Which I feel like a lot of the people we talk to, a lot of the work we've done, it's come back to our inner child and what we've been conditioned from a young age, stemming from fear, right? Fear of abandonment, fear of not feeling worthy, like the self-worth piece. And so as you're speaking, all I can think about is it all comes down to, like, as a young age, what have we been conditioned to believe? And once we recognize, oh, these are things that have been placed on me, and I have the power to do something about it, right? To talk back to my inner critic or to question these thoughts that I'm having. Like, that was a lot of work I did, was I don't have to believe everything I'm thinking. And that is empowering. So how do we start to shift this? Like, we've identified we have these self-limiting beliefs, this inner bitch. Like, how do we fight back and not let it take over our life?
That's such a good point, actually, that your thoughts are not always true, right? Your thoughts are not facts. And I think that's something that that's kind of a popular like line that's been going around social media, I think, in the mental health space. And I wish more people really embrace that. It's hard though. I get it. It's hard if the inner critic has been with you for so long. I will say one of the things that can be, so one tool that I like to introduce as kind of like if you're beginning to do the inner critic work, is to, I know this sounds weird, but saying it out loud or writing it down. But I would prefer that you say it out loud because it's a little bit more confrontational and you hear yourself saying it. And so what that does is you hear yourself saying it and it's so irrational and so extreme. And you're like, whoa, like maybe that wasn't like, I wouldn't even say that to anyone I know. I wouldn't say that to a friend. So I'll give you a perfect example. For me, the inner critic used to say, you don't deserve to rest. You can only deserve to rest if you've worked so hard that you can't go anymore. Like you need to keep pushing. So what that inner critic would say was, you're so lazy for resting. Like, how could you rest? Right. But we all have these thoughts. We just don't say it out loud. So once I said, I'm so lazy for resting, I was like, oh my God, that sounds terrible.
Oh my God, I love that. I'm going to do that because I totally say that to myself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But it's a really good way to sort of, one, confront it and then start detaching yourself, like distancing yourself from it, because you recognize that's not really me. Mm-hmm. That's coming from someplace else. Like I said, the earlier influences. I will say for me personally, that earlier influence probably came from my, immigrant parents who were, in survival mode, and they believed that working hard looked a certain way. And, to them, that was probably true. And I may have inherited some of those beliefs, but I'm now living a different life where I'm not in survival mode. So those types of things have been important for me personally to recognize. That's what I've been working on in this inner critic work.
Yeah, something I keep thinking about, and I think this whole episode I'm going to be thinking about my kids, is because I'm feeling like I want to really help them. I don't want to be a negative influence on the conversations they're having in their own mind, but part of me also thinks you might not have total control over this, right? Like you can kind of help steer your kids and uplift them, but they're going to be perceiving the world in their own way of, I'm not good at that, or comparing themselves to other people. There's so many things that are going to be happening in their life that as a parent, you don't have control over. And so I'm wondering, when they're an adult or us as adults, is it important to know exactly where these thoughts come from? Or is it just like, well, I'm here, I don't need to blame and be a victim of whatever. Like, do you think it's really important to go back and figure out where did this start? Or do you think you just go from where you're at now?
So I think it's both, right? And I think that's a really, really important question that all parents should be asking themselves. We do need to figure out where our internal baggage comes from, right? Because that's the only way we're not going to start projecting things to our own kids. So, for example, as a woman with a daughter, it might be really important for you to not project your body image issues onto her, right? But that also doesn't mean like constantly complimenting her on her body and giving all this praise. It might just mean dealing with your baggage and then also approaching things in a very neutral and non-judgmental way. So, and yes, of course, as they get older, they will inherit ideas and messaging from other people outside of the immediate household, and that's okay. I always say we can't control what happens outside the home, but they will always know that their primary caretakers are the safe space. Like we have to be consistent in how we model what we model. So as long as you're consistent, they know where to look to. And that's really all that matters. We can't control what happens outside the home. And that's look, my kid is only 2, so I can't speak too much on like what happens in the adolescent years. But, I have started practicing little things. Like if we take a family picture and I don't like the way I look, like we've all done this, right? It's like, oh, I don't like the way my chin came out. I just sort of have to pause and decide not to comment on it, right? It's like, oh, what a nice picture, or just not say anything at all. I think that's better than just better than criticizing yourself, which is what I've gotten so used to as a girl growing up, right? Could they pick up on all of that stuff? So yeah, in short, that's what I would say.
Yeah. I'm hearing you say like, not letting them hear you criticize and
That's part
kind
of
of
it for sure.
taking care of it on your own terms, like doing the work so that they do have a model of what it's like to have a healthy relationship with yourself, because they're going to pick up on that.
Absolutely.
Something that happened this morning, Brooke was here. My daughter had a really rough morning. Just little things were happening that weren't going her way. And something that I'm trying to say to her is, it's okay, you're learning. Like, we're learning. And I'm like, we should say that to ourselves as adults. Like, you never stop learning. We're always going to make mistakes. And me personally, when I make a mistake, I crush myself. I will be like, how have you not figured this out? Like, how could you make such a careless mistake? How did you forget that? Why aren't you more organized? Like, get it together. Things shouldn't look like this. You know, there's so many things I say to myself. And I think your exercise of saying out loud is so important, of like, me saying it now, it's like making me tear up because it's so mean. It's like, why do we do this to ourselves? Yeah, I love that. So thank you for that exercise. I'm going to use that.
Yeah.
I think it's so automatic. It's like taking the time to decondition and rewire so that that's not your first response. Because unless you take time to like slow down and meditate and even understand the thoughts that you're having, you're just in autopilot, and that's like your way of life. Where now you're doing this work, you're slowing down and you're recognizing when you say something and how it makes you feel. So like, I'm curious, Angela, what practices you have for people who are so unaware, but maybe, you know, like they understand they have an inner critic, but are so unaware of the thoughts that they're saying and really how it does affect them. What would you tell them to do?
Yeah. So definitely for most of us, these thoughts are so chronic and have gone on for so long so the way I describe it is, for me at least, it feels like a background noise, like a buzz in the background. And so unless you bring it to the forefront by writing it out or saying it out loud, we never really get to confront it. If you're not in a place where you can, practice that awareness yet, that's okay, right? It's about maybe trying a certain strategy that does the opposite of what your inner critic tells you. So for example, another tool that I like to use is oftentimes the inner critic might say, you haven't gotten enough done, or you need to do more.
All the time.
Or pretty much berate you for not completing all the to-do list, all the items on the to-do list, right? Mm-hmm. So what I like to practice is something called a to-did list, which at the end of the day, you write down every little thing that you did, even if it's like, I took out the trash. Like, to me, that's kind of a big deal because I hate taking out the trash. So all these little things that may or may not have been on that original to-do list, you write it out, and it gives you perspective. It helps you to realize, okay, all of these items, they account for so much time and effort throughout the day. And so it makes sense that I didn't complete that to-do list I set out to do.
That's actually something that Brooke and I do. We have a summary of what we're doing as entrepreneurs, because as entrepreneurs, there's a million things we could be doing. There's a million emails. And so we have a summary to show what each other's doing throughout the week. And I think it also shows us like, wow, I really did do a lot. I feel like I have 1,000 more things I could have, should have done. But that practice, I think, has shown us both like, we're really putting in the effort, showing each other what each other's doing. And I feel like it could even be a good practice with your spouse when you feel like you can't keep your household running, but it's like, we do a lot to keep this show going with 3 kids, activities, social life, all of the things.
And you have to do that. You have to force yourself to look at what you did do, because otherwise it's going to automatically go to what you didn't, right? Like that lack. I think it's like the scarcity mentality that we all have and we all struggle with. And so if you're not forcing yourself to look at what you did, you're going to automatically go to what you didn't do.
Exactly. The brain is so wired to go straight to the negative. It doesn't think about the positive. So in doing something like the to did list, it sounds like a small thing, but over time, you kind of retrain your brain to start or reroute the thought process to thinking about, oh, here are the things that I did do.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it gives you perspective too, as to why you didn't complete the other things. There is so much that we do in a day that we don't consider to be productive. So it's really important to remember that.
Including rest. I think that was a big switch I had of like, I've learned that rest is so important. And I think part of the reason that I don't see it that way is because I'm constantly trying to level up. I'm trying to be an entrepreneur. I'm trying to do all of these things. And then imposter syndrome creeps in. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. So let's get into what exactly is imposter syndrome and how does this relate to the inner critic?
Yeah. So the imposter syndrome is something that I'm pretty sure everyone has at some point experienced. And it's something we don't talk about, just like the inner critic, because there's a lot of shame attached to it. It's really an umbrella term of to describe a collection of feelings and thoughts. And so that can look like feeling like a fraud, like you don't belong where you are, you don't deserve what you have, just feelings of inadequacy, right? Lack of belonging is a big one too, if I didn't mention that already. So one way to look at imposter syndrome is by looking at it as a cycle, like a thought cycle. And the inner critic is also a thought feeling cycle too, where if you feel a certain way, you tend to think a certain way and vice versa. And imposter syndrome is an example of that. So the imposter syndrome cycle looks like this. First, you're faced with a task. And so you have to either prepare for it by overperforming, like in an extreme way, or you choose to procrastinate, because and that procrastination piece comes from a fear of failure. So a lot of people think, oh, I'm so lazy, I procrastinate. It's not laziness. It's because you're trying to avoid some type of fear. And usually that's a fear of failure. So that's step number two. Number one being faced with a task. So number two is you either procrastinate or overperform in a pretty extreme way. And then step three is you rationalize. After all is said and done, you rationalize, okay, well, I did well, but it was only because of luck. Or if you made a mistake or you feel like you failed, you tell yourself, well, that mistake is just proof of how incompetent I actually am. So it brings you back to feeling even more inadequate. And then with your next task, you approach it again, operating from a place of what if I'm not good enough? So it just keeps continuing. And this cycle, by the way, is, we have to credit it to Dr. Pauline Clancy, who is one of the original researchers of imposter syndrome. So we can look at this cycle to understand, where am I? And also imposter syndrome, I should mention, is situational. It's not chronic like the inner critic. It's not this background buzz. It's like a sudden heightened spike of the inner critic coming up because it's triggered by a situation, or maybe you're around certain people, or something's happening where your inner critic is now heightened.
Yeah, I can see this in so many different aspects of things that we do, right? Like having a podcast, a lot of times we're looking for proof that it's going well, right? So when our numbers spike and an episode flies off the charts, it's like, oh yeah, we're doing a good job. Like,
or vice versa.
Yeah.
It's not, and we're like, shh.
We're like, oh, do people not like us? So I can see it in that. I can also see it, and I want to hear your opinion on like identity. Like if you, like for me thinking I'm a good mom, I will totally be like, I'll go into a day at the end of my day being like, I messed up. I thought I was a good parent, but I am not doing well. And I wonder how that plays in, what that would be. That might just be the inner critic, and imposter syndrome is more, like you said, situational. But I will beat myself up about how the day went. And then when I start the next day, I'm like, I've got to overperform for this motherhood thing. Like I need to do a better job when they wake up, and I need to have a good chat with them on the way to school. And so I have this inner critic, and maybe it's imposter syndrome, with how good of a person I am or parent I am. Do you ever see that?
I think with motherhood and parenthood overall, it's a very unique type of imposter syndrome, right? Especially early on, if you haven't been around kids, you're always wondering, am I doing this right? Like, I never put my kid in a stroller until that first time I did it. And I was like, am I doing this right? You feel like an imposter, like, who gave me the license to raise this child? What I will say about that is when it comes to feeling not good enough as a parent, and if you're trying to make up for it in the next day, it's like, I think sometimes we have to step back and ask, is this for me? Is this so that I feel better about the situation? Or is this something my kids will benefit from? Is this something they need? And imposter syndrome does that to us. It makes us hyper focused on our internal stuff, our insecurities, and it makes us forget about focusing on the people that we're taking care of and what their needs might be. So I think that's an approach that I try to take.
I love that.
Not that I'm an expert in parenting.
I love that. That's really helpful to think about just being present. Like, stop trying to think about what you didn't do and what you need to do, and just focus on how are they doing.
Yeah. It's like not thinking about yourself. And I think imposter syndrome brings it back exactly to your point, Angela, of yourself. I think about even on social media, and when I'm like scrolling, oh my gosh, the comparison, it's like, who do I think I am to help people? Who am I versus how could I help? And so when I take a break from social media, when I intentionally scroll, when I'm not looking at other people's lives, then it's like, ooh, I can help people. Like, I feel empowered. And so I think being aware of what you're consuming has been super helpful when I think about imposter syndrome. Even like 15 minutes of scrolling, I feel it in my body. I'm like, oh, I can't do this, versus I make a video and I'm like, that was actually helpful. I'm proud of myself. So have you seen that, Angela, of like situational or environmental, like how people can put themselves in a place where maybe they're empowered versus they feel defeated?
With social media?
Yeah, or just, you know, motherhood, social media, like things that really tear people's ego and confidence down.
Oh, for sure. I experience it personally on a daily basis, and I have to check myself and take a pause and really think about what is going on for me internally. I can definitely speak to the social media piece for sure. I think there's I think you mentioned comparison. Comparison happens, in my opinion, most of the time when we're looking for validation to see, am I doing things right? Am I good enough? And kind of just like, that's really what comparison is, right? You're looking at how someone else is doing something or how someone else's feed looks like. Or like, those YouTube family videos, and you're like, oh, my family doesn't do that or look like that. So, we're seeking validation. We're trying to see what's wrong with me and how can I fix it? What are these other people doing? And then, jealousy is kind of like a cousin of that, right? Where jealousy is like, you now have to address your own insecurities and try not to project it in a way. No one said you're not good enough. You're just feeling these things on your own. So that's where the jealousy comes in. It's like, why am I feeling this? In the comparison can lead to jealousy in that way. So we have to be careful to know when are we projecting our unresolved baggage. That's really what it is. I would say when it comes to social media, again, admiration is kind of the opposite of those two things that I mentioned, comparison and jealousy, where you're really looking up to someone with, like in sort of an aspirational sense, like, oh, this person is so awesome. Like, how can I be more like them? And it creates this intrinsic motivation within you to aspire to do something differently or to be better. But it's not based on competition or jealousy.
Yeah. I love that.
It's almost, are they inspiring me to level up, or are they making me feel terrible about myself? And knowing which one it is. Yeah. Which I think when you're on autopilot and you're just scrolling, it's like an out of body experience where you leave. Even like your kids, they hate getting off screens because it's so addicting. And so it's like, how do we use screens and social media intentional? And I feel like we've done a very good job of that. And we still are trying to, of what we post is going to be helpful. It's not going to make people feel less than, because so many people on social media, whether they do it intentionally or not, that's what their content does.
Yeah. And I think what's helpful on social media, and I love that you do this, Angela, and I think like Brooke's saying we're trying to do, is showing people how to put this into practice. I think when you put it into practice, like these new steps or these new ideas, like everything you're saying, I love how you're like, for example, because sometimes you don't know how to put it into practice. But an example for me where admiration has been very beneficial is if I take the feeling of jealousy or inadequacy by looking at something, and then I implement about them, or I find what I like about them, I implement it in my life, and I see the benefits of, whoa, I took my jealousy, I turned it into admiration. I figured out what I liked about that. I applied it to my life, and it was helpful. So my loop now is like, oh, I feel jealousy. I want to compare myself. What is it about them I wish I had, or I wish I did, or I wish I tried? And then I do it. And then I see that loop of like, okay, next time I feel jealous, I know what to do. Because it's helpful when you feel that feeling sometimes. Do you ever see that with you, whether it's on social media or with your clients, when they're feeling like they're less than when they compare?
I like to shift the perspective on that, to be honest, and use a different framework rather than how do I tackle this jealousy and make it work for me, but rather switch it around. Because it's always like, I know this is so cliche, but the saying the grass is always greener. You are doing things online too. You're showing people things too that other people might, quite honestly, feel a little bit of jealousy or what have you around that. And you may not be realizing it. So it's about switching that perspective into thinking, am I just looking at the highlight reel here? And am I also posting just the highlights, right? Like, so rather than trying to fix the jealousy that you feel, to really just be curious about it and take a step back. Because we all play a part in the social media space.
Yeah. Curiosity is power. And also turning it back to, what am I doing, right? Instead of like the blame game, it's being curious with ourselves and how do I fit into this? What do I feel like I could shift? What perspective could I change? And also, who are you following? Like at the end of the day, that is in your control. Whether you are going on your phone or not and scrolling, whether you are following these people or not, like taking ownership, I think is something that's been super helpful for me. As I get curious with it, it's like, okay, what can I do to make me feel better?
Something that you do on social media, Angela, is you identify different types of imposter syndrome. And just following you is so helpful because you can identify with these certain things, or you can see your friends in these people or your family. You can learn so much. And so I would love if you would talk to our listeners a little bit about the different types of imposter syndrome.
So there's 5 types of imposter syndrome, again, coined by the earlier researchers of imposter syndrome. And the first one's the perfectionist. I think we know that one very, very well. So I don't need to get really into that. But basically, it's the person who overperforms and feels like they can never deem a task complete because they need to keep going back to it and fix all the little imperfections, or underperforms out of fear of failure. So again, going back to that procrastination piece. The second one is called the natural genius. It's someone that believes they should be naturally good at everything. So if they don't pick up something quickly, learn something quickly, get something done quick enough, then they beat themselves up for it. And they just resort to thinking, well, I'm just completely incompetent, right? Which, like, these are all very irrational patterns of thought. The third one is the expert. So the expert is concerned with how much they know. So it's like they believe they've got to know everything about everything. And the fourth one is the superhero. So the superhero, you can picture it as someone who is that workaholic, who is the first one into work and the last one to clock out. They juggle 100 different roles, and they might even take pride in the fact that they are that much of a workaholic, because they put their self-worth, they attach their self-worth to that. Lastly, number 5, we call the soloist. And the soloist is someone who doesn't ask for help because they're afraid that if they admit, hey, I need some help here, that it's going to be proof that they're really not competent and that they're, inadequate. The thing that people forget, though, with the soloist is, like, this is the way that I look at it. The most powerful, the most intelligent people in this world have teams of support that help them all day long, right? Like, we have like our presidents, like Oprah, right? They're not saying they're incompetent because they have teams of people helping them, right? So with a soloist, it's really going to be about recognizing your strength in knowing when and what you need help with. So that's what I always say to soloists. And I just wanted to make a note on the soloist a bit, because a lot of my Asian American clients tend to be this type, which I think is very interesting, but I have my own theories around that. But it's a really interesting type.
I would love for you to elaborate on that. Why that's such a big piece of the Asian American culture?
Well, I think that with, the way that we've been brought up, especially so most Asian Americans are first or second generation, meaning either we ourselves have immigrated or our parents have immigrated. So that cultural value is still very much in the households that we grow up. And by the cultural value specifically, what I'm referring to is like the idea of saving face, or, having shame around, seeking help around things like mental health issues, or just a lot of things where it's like, you should be able to know how to do things without, airing our dirty laundry. Like, that's a really big idea in a lot of Asian cultures. I can't speak for every Asian culture, but as a Korean American, I can definitely speak to the Korean culture when I say that. So we tend not to seek help because there's such an immense, deep amount of shame around it. So that is something that I do encounter quite frequently.
I love too that you mentioned the teams, because I feel like the teams, people that are really successful having these teams, can apply to all of these different types. Thinking about having to be the expert and knowing everything. Nope. You hire people that are experts to work for you, right? And the perfectionist, like, you don't have to do it all right because you have so many other people that are doing things right for you too, so that you can focus on like your part of the puzzle. And I think, especially as an entrepreneur, I think that's important when you're starting out or in any aspect of your life, that a lot of people, when you see someone crushing it at momhood online, they have a nanny, they have a tutor, they have someone that drives their kid to school. They have so much money and they have so much success that they're not doing it all on their own. It looks like they're killing it. Their house is super organized, but like they probably hired an organizer, Such a great point.
Do you think people can identify with multiple types?
For sure, you can have a combination of 2 or more. But for most people, I think they'll find that there's 1 or 2 that come up the most. It's also situational, like I said. So I might feel like I have to be a perfectionist when it comes to one thing. And then I might feel like I've got to be a soloist when it comes to another thing. So it really depends. I do want to point out that it's not, these 5 types are not meant to be all defining or diagnostic in any way. It's just a helpful way for us to understand how imposter syndrome can look like in these different ways.
Yeah. So someone identifies themselves and say, the natural genius or the expert, they recognize that. And then what? Like, what would you say next steps are for kind of deconditioning this type so that they can have some freedom?
Yeah. Well, I think that it's about interrupting and rerouting that thought cycle that we talked about before. Okay, so whether you're the natural genius or expert or what have you, you're obviously not going to say to yourself, oh, I'm being the natural genius. You just have these traits that tell you that you have certain beliefs about yourself, right? So you have to recognize where you are in that thought cycle that makes you believe, why do I have to believe that I have to be naturally good at everything, right? And no matter what type of imposter syndrome you have, it's going to be about kind of expanding or pushing outside of that comfort zone. So what I mean by that is if you're a perfectionist, right, and you have a really hard time getting started on something, how can you slightly stretch a little bit to take slightly messy action, right? Can you send that email without reading it for the 300th time?
Oh, man.
Right. And it's like, it's uncomfortable for sure, but we have to remember that uncomfortable doesn't mean unsafe. Very different things. It's okay to feel uncomfortable. So it's about constantly practicing those baby steps towards stretching outside your comfort zone.
I love that. I love that. Being uncomfortable does not mean you are unsafe. I'm going to say that to myself every day.
1,000,000 times throughout the day.
Yes.
That is so helpful. Thank you.
Just a quick note on what you said, Andrea, about motherhood and imposter syndrome. You know, we have to remember that imposter syndrome, that term it came up by these two researchers back in the day who were studying specifically white women in high achieving academic settings. So it doesn't necessarily apply to all people. It's just the term that we're using and we're trying to apply it in the best way possible. So, for example, when you said there are mothers out there who have help and nannies, and yeah, we can't compare ourselves to them if we don't have those things. So we have to understand it's not really about you as an individual with something that you've got to fix. It's really your environment too. So we've got to look at how imposter syndrome is felt by not only people of color, but other folks with marginalized identities, right? So poor women who are raising children, socioeconomic status is a big one, right? The queer community, neurodiverse folks. So it's not this one size fits all explanation of what imposter syndrome is. And my hope is that, just sort of looking to the future, is that we can come up with more language and more research to help people in these different groups understand their experiences as well.
Oh, I love that you just said that, because it's so important to consider and think about where these studies came from. It's something we don't really think about as white women, right? Mm-hmm. That we need more research for more types of people and more circumstances so that, you know, we can apply concepts that help us level up, right? We can apply concepts that help us understand ourselves better and how to create a happier, more cohesive unit or life. And it just speaks to more about the work that you're doing and how important it is who you're speaking to and what you're considering as a therapist. It's beautiful. I'm so happy we found you, and I need everybody to find you. So if they would like to follow you, see the work that you're doing, where can they find you?
So I'm pretty active on Instagram. That's the only social media platform that I use, because if I do anything more, I will be very overwhelmed. I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with social media, but I love what I'm doing on social media. So you can find me at angela.lcsw. I also have a course on the inner critic, all things from top to bottom, where I talk about all of the things that we talked about, plus a deeper dive into these topics. And you can find that on my website, angelalcsw.com.
Yeah, so go to the show notes after this episode's done. Click the links, follow Angela, get her course. Also tune into her weekly lives. They're so, so helpful. Angela, you have given so many tips, so many golden nuggets. We are so grateful for your time. We know it's so valuable. So we would love you to leave us with your 3 gold stars. These are just your 3 takeaways that anyone listening can grab and move forward with that can help up-level their life.
I'll make them quite easy because I don't want to leave with like an overwhelming list. I always want it to feel doable for folks who are doing this inner critic work. So number one, I would say simply start with a to-did list, right? Like at the end of the day, try it out. Um, Number two, like I said, say your self-critical thoughts out loud, see how that feels. It might be uncomfortable, but it's really going to be the starting point in, that journey to detaching from your self-critical thoughts. Number three, I would say, as cliche as it sounds, talk about it. Talk about it to your friends, right? Because chances are you'll learn that everyone around you has experienced something similar. And there's no reason to feel isolated in that. And the worst thing is thinking that you're alone. So talk about it and get support around it. It doesn't have to be mental health support. It can just be the people around you who relate to you. So those are my three.
Thank you. I love those tips.
So good.
But we've got to put them into practice. That's the whole thing. We give these 3 gold stars, but put them into practice, maybe one a week, one a day, whatever feels doable. Like you said, I think that's a really good point, is that these tips are great, but implementing them is really what creates the difference.
Yeah. It's one thing to listen, but it's another thing to own it and actually do it. I heard from Tony Robbins, my guy, a while back. There's a difference between knowing it and owning it. And that's exactly what Andrea is saying. So if you're listening, kudos to you for sitting down, for taking this time to pour into you. It is not easy work, but it is so important. It is life-changing. And so if you're listening, give yourself a high five. We're so proud of you.
All right, next is Unleashing Ivy. Questions just to dig a little deeper, help people grow. Ivy grows in hard places.
Sure does.
My question is about self-confidence and self-esteem. What's the difference between the two?
I'll put it this way. Self-confidence is saying, I know that I can do this. Self-esteem is whether or not I succeed or fail, I still know my worth. So the difference there is self-confidence is really about your belief in your ability to do something well. And self-esteem is more of an unwavering sense of your self-worth. Does that make sense?
I feel like it's like the doing and the being. Like the confidence is I can do this, and the being is like no matter what I do, I'm still worthy of life and success, loving myself. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. It's worthiness. It's your sense of worthiness. That's where self-esteem comes from. Your actions have to align with your core values. It's more of a foundational, like your sense of self. And confidence is just a piece of that. It's, do I know I can do this or not?
I'm sorry. I'm going to keep asking questions about this because I've been thinking about self-esteem a lot. Do you think people are born with low self-esteem? They're conditioned? Do you think it's a mix? And how do you build your self-esteem?
I don't think that people are born with a low self-esteem. I truly, honestly believe that babies they are the purest form of self-love. They ask for what they need. They say no when they don't want something. They know themselves. They eat intuitively. Like, we know that. They don't do anything to please others. And what happens over time is that gets stripped away, that intuition, because of all the messaging that we receive. So how do we work back to that pure form of self-love is, the word authenticity comes up for me, which, a lot of times authenticity, we think it's about, being your imperfect hot mess of yourself, right? But it's also about shedding those layers of, self-critical thinking that isn't truly you. You have to recognize, where does it come from? How can I do that work to let go of that and then show up as my full self? I think that's how we can make our way towards better self-esteem.
I love that. Thank you.
So good. And it shows you that it's something everyone deals with, right? We all have this messaging. And so to decondition what this messaging has for so long been telling us is something we can all do. My question has to do with you being a licensed clinical social worker. What would you say is your favorite thing and your least favorite thing?
I'll start with my least favorite thing, if that's okay. My least favorite thing is like talking to strangers and having that small talk where it's like, oh, what do you do? And I have to say I'm a therapist. And the reactions are always really funny. It's like airplane conversations, right? Like sometimes people think I can read their mind, or they start to like dive into their relationship issues, and I'm like, I don't give advice. I'm sorry.
And I'm not at the clock.
Yeah, I'm not at the clock right now.
Exactly. My therapist hat is off. My favorite part of being a therapist, or more specifically, a clinical social worker, is that when I approach doing this work as a mental health professional, because my background is in social work, I'm always able to bring in sort of that social justice piece and that lens into my work. And it is very relevant because I work with a lot of folks of color. So that's my favorite part.
I love that. All right. And last question. I don't want to do the last question. I just want to keep asking you questions. I have so many, but we understand there's, other things you have to do in life. But the last question is, if you could tell your younger self something, what would you tell her?
I would tell my younger self just to keep moving forward and just to keep doing what I'm doing. Because as a recovered perfectionist, I often felt paralyzed and I doubted my decisions. And I just never took messy action. But I would tell her, the more messy action you take, the more you'll learn about yourself, and more quickly too. And I wish I had known that sooner.
Thank you for sharing that.
And thank you for taking the messy action and doing it, because the work you're doing is incredible. It's helping so many people. It's helping us. It's helping our audience. And so we just want to say thank you. We're so grateful that you're doing the work you're doing, and please keep doing it.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
This was really fun.
Yes. I feel like I'm going to come down to Austin and not sit on your couch, even though your couch is very beautiful. We'll get coffee or something and talk about life. But yeah, the last segment of our show is a piece of gold, which everything you've shared has been gold. But would you share your favorite quote?
Unlike self-criticism, which asks if you're good enough, self-compassion asks what's good for you. And that is credited to Kristen Neff, PhD. She is a researcher on self-compassion. And who knew that self-compassion is actually therapeutically and something that is researchable. It's used in therapy. So it's a tool. I thought that was a beautiful quote.
This is Gold Ivy signing off.
Listen to your truth and go chase your gold.